All right, so we start working on chapter 15 here. I'm probably going to break this up into three sections. 15 is a pretty long chapter, um, so as we move through, we'll get through those different sections. And this is abnormal psych, different disorders and treatment modalities that are used with them. So, as we move through chapter 15, we're going to talk about understanding the different diagnoses, the treatments that are involved. Kind of with a distinction of between what's kind of a disorder and what's just being a person, um, and then the treatments that are designed for different diagnoses that we may see throughout this chapter. Um, so there's this continued kind of debate or issue today of distinguishing like what's a normal behavior versus abnormal behavior, what's diagnostic, um, what's maybe just a little weird but not necessarily a diagnosis, and things like this. So as we start looking at these issues, the factors that come into play are kind of cultural context, um, occupational context, relational context, and kind of functioning in daily life. So when we look at this kind of quote unquote definition of abnormal, there is no clear definition. And so there's been some different kind of subjective experiences as far as what is a diagnostic. When we're dealing with issues like anxiety or depression, there is subjective feelings of distress, and people handle these at different levels. And we might see that some people engage in dangerous or bizarre behaviors, and if the person doesn't recognize this, is it diagnostic or is it not? Are people that are engaging in thrill-seeking behaviors experiencing some type of diagnosis or not? This is where things get tricky. And then just the debate in itself of diagnosis becomes a tricky subject matter. Even hedonic drives, kind of going, is this a symptom? And when we're looking, not hedonic, heroic, sorry, are people doing things that are putting their lives at risk? People running into burning buildings to take someone out, that's putting yourself in harm's way. Heroes of war that are putting their lives at risk, that this isn't diagnostic, this is something that we do to save fellow people, and putting yourself at risk for some diagnoses is one of the characteristics. So dealing with cultural influences, just some definition-y stuff that you guys want to know, and kind of abnormal psychology throughout history, that demonic possession used to be a thing that they thought existed. Most likely this would probably be some type of delusional disorder or schizophrenia, brain fog syndrome running amok. And so part of this is also is making us aware that we need to be aware of cultural instances or cultural definitions or cultural explanations, and that they're not always diagnostic. Sometimes it's a symptom or an expression of a particular culture or subculture, and they may experience different diagnoses in different ways, or at least explain diagnoses in different ways. Other things that we kind of have coming out are that you'll see diagnostic criteria change, or the names of diagnoses change, because they are historically based and they're culturally based, as well as being evidence-based. Multiple personality disorder is not a disorder that exists anymore, at least by the DSM standards. Multiple personalities was married into the dissociative identity disorder category a while back, because they're finding that there's such low cases of multiple personalities, and there's more dissociative issues that come out of this than there are of people experiencing multiple personalities. Other things that they were finding is that some individuals with multiple personalities may have been exacerbated by their therapist, not necessarily that they possessed multiple personalities. The multiple personality individuals are kind of unicorns in the diagnostic world, and they are very interesting, and they're very interesting cases. And so some critics have argued that they've been made worse by certain therapists that wanted to find more personalities and more personalities and more personalities. There's this biopsychosocial kind of route that comes into play. And we talked a little bit about this, I think, in chapter 1, which is some of the nature-nurture stuff of, we have biological predispositions for depression, for anxiety, for bipolar, for schizophrenia. And there's also these sociological mechanisms of how we're treated and the validating versus invalidating environments that we're put in, and all of these kind of, coalesce to make who we are, our genetics and diseases that we're experiencing and neurotransmitters that we have or produce less of or more of, hormonal imbalances, and these all play a role. So it's when we're looking at treatment stuff, which we'll talk about later in the chapter, it becomes difficult to pinpoint like an A equals B type of formula. And even if we do, like if we go back to this happened to you when you were 6 years old and that's why you have PTSD, it doesn't undo what happened to you at 6. So we still have to work the treatment modality as it is to help get through. So within this biopsychosocial context, there are the psychological roots. This is your history, your experiences, your ability to cope, your ability to deal with stress, how well you deal with it, how well you handle it, your physiological reactions to it. Some people are, more vulnerable to stress. Other people are less vulnerable. This is that cortisol production and responses, and epinephrine and norepinephrine and all these things that are going on, as well as social and cultural context. This could be your family. It could be your subculture that you live in. It could be cross-cultural, that if you have parents from a different country that may not acknowledge or express anxiety or depression, and certain expectations that come out of things like this. So one just kind of case of example, I work with a number of individuals that have a diagnosis called borderline personality disorder, and that predominantly, statistically speaking, is a female diagnosis. Now, some people have argued that there may be more males with BPD, borderline personality disorder, than what the data is actually showing. But what tends to happen is when males seek treatment that have BPD, some of those behaviors and responses overlap with that of narcissism or antisocial personality disorder, so they may receive that diagnosis, versus if you have a woman come into the office, experience these traits, she may get a diagnosis of BPD. So there are these cultural contexts that sometimes get tricky too, and there's overlapping of diagnostic criteria as well. So that brings us to the DSM. This is a diagnostic and statistical manual. This is kind of our Bible for diagnosis. It allows us to look at symptoms and see if people check off, do they have depression or do they have anxiety and things like this. What's kind of cool about the DSM-5 that's come out is prior to the DSM-5, diagnoses was more of a checkbox. Do you meet 6 of these 12 criteria? Do you meet 8 of these 10 criteria? Then you have a diagnosis of anxiety or depression or borderline personality disorder. Now the way the DSM-5 is looking at it is more of a sliding scale and kind of levels of severity, and acknowledging that at some point many people will experience some symptoms, and it's not always psychopathology. Most of us at some point in our life will experience some type of depression symptoms. Doesn't mean we all have depression or some type of anxiety symptoms. And so the DSM-5 looks at this more on a sliding scale than of check boxes of you have it or you don't. It does allow us to get diagnostic criteria to see what's going on. And this is where the DSM is a bit debated, because there's some people like that. I don't agree with diagnosis. I don't think we should diagnose people. And there's another end of the spectrum that's like, well, if we have a diagnosis and we know a treatment that works, when we find the diagnosis, we can use the right treatment. If we go kind of into a medical model to think about this for sake of example, if I have lung cancer, I want to know I have lung cancer so I can get the best treatment for lung cancer possible, instead of being like, well, we don't really like giving a diagnosis, so we're just going to treat you with a whole bunch of different things and hope that it works. So this is where the debate's kind of going. And as evidence becomes better and science becomes better and we start to get better understanding of diagnoses, hopefully the DSM will get cleaned up a bit as well. So it does, the DSM-4 was built on these 5 axes, which we'll talk about in the next couple of slides. Axis 1 is our clinical disorder, and this is usually our psychological disorders that are listed here. Axis 2 is our personality disorders. This would be like antisocial personality, narcissism, borderline personality disorder. Or Axis 1 stuff would be depression, bipolar, schizophrenia, things like that. Axis 3 is kind of medical issues that may have an effect on mood or behavior. If someone has like hypothyroidism and that exacerbates depression or anxiety, that'll play a role. 4 is psychosocial problems. This could be family environment, it could be work environment, it could be occupational stressors, all of the above. And then Axis 5 is referred to as a GAF, or a Global Assessment of Functioning, which was a 1 to 100 scale, 1 being no functioning at all, 100 being functioning kind of as effective as possible. And a GAF is given based on kind of where we see how people are performing at work, in life, in jobs, in school, with family, with friends. So some of the critiques of the DSM are that, what makes someone a diagnosis versus not a diagnosis, is 5 months a problem and 6 months not, or is 6 months a problem and 5 months not. So for sake of example, when we look at like depression correlated with grief, there's a timeline that kind of comes in with the DSM. And so like after 12 months, if someone's still depressed, this may be diagnostic depressive grief, versus if someone kind of gets over it in 11 months, we may just say that they were dealing with grief. Some people have kind of argued, is this arbitrary? Is this evidence-based? Is there science behind this? And then other types of behavior, such as criminal behavior, are these mental illnesses, or these kind of, innate human problems, such as someone being evil? Other things that we talk about is this idea of, are people just adjusting to life? Is this a mental illness? There is a DSM diagnosis called adjustment disorder, which kind of is, people don't fit into any one particular compartment. Like they may have some depression, some anxiety, some other symptoms of XYZ. Typically, adjustment disorder is given when someone does have some type of life adjustment, adjusting to work, a divorce, retirement, but it's not necessarily a specific diagnosis. And like I mentioned, a couple of previous slides about the example with borderline personality disorder, the statistics on prevalence of disorders is uncertain. Sometimes it's inflated for certain populations. Some groups may be better at hiding it than other groups. Some groups may be able to use it as a particular skill set. And so like for sake of example, like with narcissism, there's probably underreported numbers of people diagnosed with narcissism, because narcissists typically don't go seek help. And that's the same thing we're probably seeing with like antisocial personality disorder as well. So it gets tricky. Just kind of a graphic representation that we do see within a lifetime. Some people experience some symptoms within a given year. They will experience some symptoms. Another problem that comes into play here is the stigmatization that comes associated with having a diagnosis. I've had a number of people tell me they don't want a diagnosis of like depression or anxiety. When we look at substance abuse diagnoses, like this is sometimes a bit of a scarlet letter for some individuals to carry with them, because it may make it harder to find work. Other things that happen if people get labeled with a substance abuse diagnosis, if they end up in an ER or a hospital and they have real legitimate complaints like about pain, the doc may just write them off as med seeking, and not necessarily that the person is in pain. So again, we've got to be mindful of the stigmatization that comes with this, and also people that are kind of ignorant to it are like, well, why don't you just get over the depression? Or instead of being anxious, why don't you just go do the thing that makes you anxious? And I mean, if it was that easy, people would be doing these things. So what kind of determines psychopathology versus normal functioning? At some point, we're all going to feel sad, angry, anxious, etc. What makes us kind of get into the psychopathology world is that there is some type of interference with functioning. It disrupts relationships, it disrupts jobs, it disrupts school, achieving goals that we wanted to achieve. When we're starting to check these boxes, is now we're looking at psychopathology.